This is the story of what happened when a routine cargo scan flagged a single density anomaly at a mid-Atlantic port, and Homeland Security Investigations agents opened a sealed shipping container to find a child hidden behind 40 crates of commercial freight. The child was alive. The network behind it was already under federal investigation within hours, and the only reason any of it unfolded the way it did was that one CBP officer decided a faint irregularity on an imaging screen deserved a second look. Millions of shipping containers move through American ports every year, and that volume is exactly what trafficking networks count on. At any given moment, thousands of containers sit stacked on terminal lots waiting to be cleared, cataloged, and released. And the sheer scale of that operation creates gaps that criminal organizations have studied and exploited for years. This particular container had originated overseas and arrived at a mid-Atlantic port facility with paperwork that held up on first inspection. The manifest listed commercial dry goods, packaged food products with consistent weight and standard dimensions, and the shipper carried a prior import history that showed no red flags. Nothing separated this container from the 10,000 others processed that week, and that's exactly how it was designed to look. CBP's layered screening system caught it anyway. A density anomaly appeared in the imaging scan, not dramatic, not a clear outline of anything identifiable, just a faint irregularity in a section of the container where the numbers didn't fully match the declared cargo. A trained officer looked at that reading and decided it warranted escalation rather than a note in the file, and that decision is what changed everything that followed. The referral went to HSI. Homeland Security Investigations handles cases that sit where border security and serious organized crime overlap, and that specific combination is what makes HSI the right agency for freight trafficking operations. Human trafficking, narcotic smuggling, financial networks tied to transnational organizations. These cases require investigative depth that a checkpoint officer cannot provide alone, and HSI builds that depth through parallel lines of inquiry run simultaneously. When the referral arrived, agents moved fast and quietly. The container received a hold order, which prevented it from leaving the terminal lot, and HSY coordinated with CBP and port security to stage a controlled inspection during a period of normal terminal activity. Controlled matters in these cases because the way a container gets opened can determine what happens to the person inside, and because a visible law enforcement presence at the wrong moment can alert anyone monitoring the shipment from a distance. Agents had no confirmation a human being was inside. What they had was a density anomaly, and the experience that comes from working these cases long enough to know what a concealment void looks like on an imaging screen versus what it looks like when you're standing in front of the doors. The doors opened, and the cargo was real, stacked floor to ceiling in the front half of the container, arranged to produce exactly the imaging profile the manifest described. None of that mattered because behind that wall of freight, in a space smaller than most walk-in closets, was a child. Federal case documentation in HSY trafficking operations describes these concealment scenarios with language like victim located in a constructed void space within the cargo area. And that clinical framing doesn't carry what agents describe when they talk about these moments years later. Dehydrated, disoriented, and conditioned not to make noise, the child had spent an unknown number of hours in a sealed metal container crossing open water, with no control over temperature, ventilation, or how long the journey would take. Survival in these scenarios depends entirely on variables the victim cannot influence, and that is by design, because trafficking networks that use freight concealment aren't improvised operations running on luck. They're logistics problems that someone solved deliberately. Emergency medical response arrived within minutes of the discovery, and a victim advocate was on scene within the hour. Because HSY's protocol in child recovery cases runs both tracks simultaneously, the medical team handled triage for dehydration and exposure, while agents began establishing the chain of custody documentation that an eventual prosecution would depend on. And those two things had to happen at the same time without one disrupting the other. The child was alive. And from that moment forward, every decision the investigation made was built around keeping it that way in every sense of the phrase. Rescuing a victim closes the immediate emergency and opens the actual case. And what HSI does in the hours after a freight interception determines how far up the network the prosecution eventually reaches. Agents worked backward through the container's documented chain of custody from the moment the doors closed on the inspection. Who loaded it? Who sealed it? Who signed the manifest? Who arranged the shipping contract? Every hand the container passed through on its journey to that port became a subject of simultaneous inquiry, and HSI ran those threads in parallel rather than sequentially because the clock on domestic contacts goes cold fast. Someone was waiting for that container. Freight trafficking operations built around commercial shipments don't drop cargo at a port and hope for the best. There's a recipient, a broker, a handler who expected to take custody at the terminal, and identifying that endpoint before it vanished was the priority that ran alongside everything else. HSY's investigative model in these cases follows the money and the logistics at the same time, because trafficking networks that can access legitimate commercial shipping infrastructure leave financial traces in both directions, and neither trail waits for investigators to finish with the other one first. The reason traffickers use commercial shipping isn't complicated, and understanding it explains why cases like this one are harder to detect than almost any other trafficking method. A port processing thousands of containers daily presents a statistical problem that no screening system fully solves. Advanced imaging technology, behavioral analysis programs, and experienced officers at checkpoints. All of it is real, and none of it can physically inspect every flagged unit without shutting down commerce. Trafficking networks know this. The use of legitimate-looking manifests, established import histories, and correctly weighted cargo isn't accidental. It's the methodology, refined through trial and error, and the knowledge that volume provides cover. HSI's Blue campaign has identified freight concealment as one of the most dangerous transport methods for victims, and children face specific risks within that category because they're often moved under what investigators call a controlled delivery model, meaning the trafficker intends to collect the victim at the destination, and the child has been conditioned before the container is sealed not to make noise or signal for help. That conditioning is why some victims don't call out even when they have the chance. And it's why HSI agents approaching these containers can't assume that silence means the container is empty. What nobody expects, the first time they learn how these operations work, is how much of the danger to the victim happens before any law enforcement contact at all, in the hours inside a sealed box where the outcome depends entirely on physics and time. Federal trafficking cases built on freight interceptions don't close with a single arrest at the port terminal, and that's by design. Because HSY's goal isn't the lowest level handler, it's the network structure that made the shipment possible. The investigation that opened when the container doors swung back extended across weeks of parallel inquiry, with agents working origin logistics, domestic endpoint contacts, and financial infrastructure simultaneously. HSI coordinated with the Department of Justice's Human Trafficking Prosecution Unit, and where international origins connected to the case, established legal cooperation agreements, brought foreign law enforcement partners into the operation through channels that take time to activate but produce evidence that holds up in federal court. Charges in freight trafficking cases with a minor victim carry weight that reflects what was done. Transportation of a minor, conspiracy to commit human trafficking, and money laundering charges where financial networks surface. Federal sentencing guidelines on child trafficking offenses carry mandatory minimums that result in sentences measured in decades, not years. And every person the investigation connected to this container's journey faced that exposure when the prosecution finally moved. Federal protocol protects minor victims in trafficking cases completely, which means names, countries of origin, and the specific circumstances that put a child in a sealed shipping container never enter the public record in any form that could identify them. What the record shows is the protocol that follows rescue. Unaccompanied foreign national minors recovered from trafficking situations enter the care of the Office of Refugee Resettlement, while domestic cases route through state child protective services, and HSI victim advocates stay involved through the investigative process to ensure that any cooperation with investigators is voluntary and handled in a way that doesn't compound the trauma the child has already survived. The prosecution matters, and the arrests matter, and the network dismantlement matters. And when agents in these cases talk about why they do the work, none of those things are actually what they're talking about. What they mean is the part that never makes the federal docket, the stabilization process that happens quietly after the case file closes. The child who gets to have a future because a CBP officer escalated a density anomaly and an HSI team opened a container carefully enough not to make it worse. That outcome doesn't generate headlines. It just happens because the right people showed up when it counted. Conclusion: A density anomaly on an imaging screen. That's where this case started. A faint irregularity that could have been logged as instrument noise and moved past without a second thought. What followed was a child recovered alive, a trafficking network under federal investigation within hours of the container being opened, and a prosecution built on the investigative work that HSI ran simultaneously on every thread that connected to that shipment. The networks that use commercial freight as a trafficking method operate on the assumption that volume will protect them, that the math of port operations makes detection unlikely enough to be worth the risk. And that assumption holds right up until the moment a trained officer decides a number that doesn't quite add up deserves another look. On this day, at this port, the math didn't hold. HSY's work in freight trafficking cases doesn't stop at the interception. The financial networks that fund these operations across international borders are a separate investigation that runs parallel to everything else. And how agents follow that money is what the next video covers. Subscribe now so you don't miss it.